Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, I'm Bricky Babe. If you found me from my first video, this one's going to be quite a bit different, but I promise I will post more Sims content soon. So please stick around for that. I also have a get ready video in the works. This is my very first video essay. It's not going to be perfect, and I will definitely stutter, but I'm trying my best and I will continue to do better. I'm also not a perfect activist or feminist either. I'm learning, growing, and making mistakes along the way. That's part of why I'm making this video, to think more deeply about the games I love and the culture I grew up in. I want this to be a conversation, not a lecture. I'm open to good faith critiques if you have them. Most importantly, and please remember this throughout the video, this is not an attack on gamers. I still love video games. I still play them. I make my living right now streaming myself playing them on Twitch. This isn't about shaming players for the media they enjoy. This is about diving deeper and asking the harder questions, not whether about gaming is too woke, but about what the outrage over the wokeness really reveals. It's about power, culture, media, and the stories that were told through these games, and why some people are so angry when these stories start to change. So without further ado, let's get right into it. Video games are a form of social and cultural media that both reflect and shape our political climate. This deep dive explores how systemic issues, misogyny, racism, homophobia, and Orientalist propaganda are actively woven into today's gaming culture. Games don't exist in a vacuum. Like other forms of media we consume, they're cultural pieces crafted by people who are, consciously or not, influenced by politics, economics, history, and ideology. As products of their time, games carry the imprints of patriarchy, capitalism, white supremacy, and colonialism. When we look at games this way, we begin to understand that representation isn't just about checking a diversity box. It's about power. Who gets to be the hero? Who is silenced or erased? Whose trauma is commodified, and whose is ignored? These aren't trivial questions. They're fundamental to how media reinforces or challenges dominant narratives, and how society around it reacts. Why video games have never been apolitical. Despite decades of resistance from industry executives, YouTubers, and Twitter threads insisting that video games should be just for fun, video games have never been apolitical. From Cold War era arcade shooters to climate dystopias, games have always reflected the values, fears, and ideologies of their creators and audiences. Just like every other form of media we consume, like movies, shows, art, and music, the push to portray games as neutral itself is a political stance, one that conveniently protects the status quo. Take Call of Duty or Battlefield, for example. They're blockbuster franchises, rooted in nationalism, American exceptionalism, and military worship. These games don't just simulate war, they endorse it. They're often made in collaboration with the US military, designed to recruit and reinforce patriotic narratives, and yet few players question them as political. Meanwhile, a game with a black female protagonist is instantly accused of being too woke. This isn't accidental. It's a reflection of what media scholar Edward Said called Orientalism, the process by which Western art, literature, and media construct the East as exotic, barbaric, and inferior. These stereotypes prop up a world order that normalizes Western violence and portrays non-Western resistance as savagery. These games often feature enemies screaming in Arabic, dressed in keffiyehs with brown skin and thick beards, portrayed as threats to global stability, all while the player, as an elite Western soldier, is the hero, bringing order and either saving or dominating. This isn't just storytelling, it's propaganda. And when those assumptions are challenged, when games feature queer characters, critique colonization, or even just include a black woman on the cover, that's when we start hearing outrage about politics being shoved down our throats. In other words, when the story caters to you, it's just a game. When it doesn't, that's when it's a problem. Why representation became a culture war. In the wake of BLM, #MeToo, and growing calls for media representation, many game studios began spotlighting marginalized characters. However, as the political tide shifted more right, so did the reaction. Suddenly, representation was rebranded as forced diversity. Developers who added queer, trans, or non-white characters were accused of pandering to the woke agenda. Even when those characters were fully developed and central to the story, online outrage painted them as diversity checkboxes. What once might have been casual complaints on a forum are now full-blown ecosystems of rage-driven content, with creators monetizing on this content by framing any inclusive decision as a political attack on real gamers. This is a backlash economy, and it's booming. Platforms like YouTube, Twitch, and especially X have labeled a new genre of reactionary creators. These influencers thrive on clicks generated by outrage. A game's release has a black female protagonist, they upload thumbnails like "gaming is dead" or "the woke agenda has gone too far." The success of these posts have less to do with the genuine critique and more to do with tapping into the profitability of rage, racism, and sexism. Take South of Midnight, for example, a third-person action-adventure game revealed in 2023 featuring a black female protagonist named Hazel in a southern gothic world inspired by black folklore. The game had barely shown any gameplay, it was just the trailer, before hate poured in, post-mocking Hazel's hair, her voice, accusing the studio of hiring her for diversity points, and insisting the game was destined to fail. This backlash wasn't rooted in quality concerns. It was fueled by the mere presence of a black female protagonist in a magical southern setting. Since the release, it got amazing reviews. I played this game recently and I absolutely loved it. It's definitely my favorite game of the year. What's even more disturbing are the viral mods circulating online, where users alter games to erase marginalized characters entirely, replacing some women with male models, changing skin tones to white, thinning out female characters, erasing queer characters, or removing pride flags. A mod for Spider-Man Remastered replaced pride flags with American flags. This mod went viral after being uploaded to Nexus Mods, and it was subsequently removed for violating site policy. However, it continued to circulate elsewhere and sparked widespread discussions, with supporters praising it as a return to normalcy. Similarly, one viral X thread from April 2024 featured several mods that completely erased character diversity in very popular games. Examples include replacing a plus-sized black woman character with a skinny white woman, and often de-queering outfits or dialogue from the games. These mods are labeled proudly as unwoke versions, and their replies include things like, "Finally I can play this game without propaganda," and "back to how games used to be." These aren't fringe views. Posts like this receive tens of thousands of likes and shares. It's not hard to see that the performative tantrums aren't about game quality. They're about power and ownership. This isn't about game mechanics, plot, or even aesthetics. It's about visibility. When players are used to seeing straight, cis, white men as the default, any deviation becomes a perceived threat. Studios are accused of politicizing games for doing something as simple as letting queer characters kiss, giving trans characters a side quest, or featuring a black woman that isn't a caricature. But the backlash reveals a deeper fear, that marginalized people are no longer silent or sidelined. And as political correctness fell out of the favor pot post-Trump's first term, we've seen a rise in content creators, influencers, and even developers walking back on inclusive narratives. Games are increasingly designed to be apolitical again, or rather, to avoid being called woke, even as they continue to reflect political worldviews throughout the game. When we hear terms like "finally, games are great again" once characters of color are removed, we need to think about how that directly reflects current political climate, with similar, if not the exact same rhetoric in mainstream media and politics. This regression isn't neutral, it's a retreat. It tells us something about how power reacts when it's challenged even slightly, not by violence, but by basic visibility. I want to restate that this isn't just a few bad apples. The reactionary anti-woke movement has grown into a greater political grift. Many of the same influencers who mocked and cried cancel culture now lead campaigns to cancel games with diverse casts, calling for boycotts, refunds, hate floods, and developer firings. They were not against cancel culture. They wanted to be the ones canceling it. Let me repeat that again. They were not against cancel culture. They just wanted to be the ones wielding it. At the heart of that fear is that gaming is changing. It's no longer theirs alone. That women, queer people, BIPOC gamers are not only playing, but making games too. The backlash isn't a spontaneous reaction. It's a deliberate monetized campaign to push marginalized voices back out of the spotlight. These mods aren't just aesthetic tinkering. They're an ideological stance, an attempt at digital erasure. They reflect a symbolic rejection of inclusion and a desire to reassert control over who belongs in gaming spaces. This is why it's critical for mod platforms and game developers to take a firm stance against such content. Stories that reflect a wider range of human experiences told with passion and thought are not only harder to erase, but more powerful in challenging the status quo. One of the most persistent lies in gaming discourse is that female leads are inherently unpopular. You've heard the comments. They're forcing girl bosses down our throats. This is why the game failed. They made her ugly to spite us. The backlash of The Last of Us Part 2 became a cultural landmark of this rhetoric. When the game launched in 2020, Ellie, a queer woman, took center stage as a playable lead. The story was violent, raw, and emotionally complex. But what should have sparked conversations about grief and vengeance instead became a flood of misogyny and homophobia. Gamers criticized the other playable lead, Abby's, muscular build, accusing the developers of pushing a trans agenda. Abby isn't even trans. Ellie's sexuality was mocked, and YouTube was flooded with thumbnails like, "The Last of Us destroys itself with woke nonsense." The irony? The Last of Us is a game about systemic collapse, government control, and rebellion. But when that rebellion is centered on women, it was suddenly too political. This surface-level backlash obscured more meaningful critiques from marginalized players. Despite the game's diverse cast, many players of color, especially black players, noted the lack of narrative depth given to characters of color. While white characters like Ellie and Abby receive sprawling arcs filled with nuance, the racialized characters often serve to propel the white lead's emotional journeys or died for their development. This often isn't meaningful representation, it's tokenization in a prettier wrapper. Then, there's the contradiction of Neil Druckmann, the co-developer of the franchise. While the games depict an anti-authoritarian theme, Druckmann allegedly signed the No Hostage Left Behind open letter in 2023, a letter thanking Joe Biden and echoing Israel's narrative about the genocide in Gaza. Critics point out that The Last of Us Part 2 metaphorically echoes the framing of the current attack on Palestinians. One side is a brutal, unstructured military force, and the other, the wolves in the game, are described as terrorists. He allegedly even said he used his experience in Israel to inspire the game. This isn't about shaming fans. This game is so popular. Many loved The Last of Us Part 2. It's about sitting with complexity. When a game centers male trauma, it's praised for its depth. When it centers women or queerness, it's seen as agenda-driven. When developers tell stories of resistance while aligning with real-world oppression, we need to ask what stories are being told and who gets to tell them. How military shooters shape our view of the world and each other, even if you don't realize it. Before I start this section, I want to clarify that this is not an argument that video games make people violent or cause real-life shootings. That outdated moral panic has been weaponized for decades to scapegoat the games people play to avoid real conversations about gun violence and social decay. Instead, what I'm exploring here is how deeply conditioned, normalized, and baked in Islamophobia and anti-Arab narratives have become, especially in shooters. This isn't about individual harm, but cultural conditioning that the individual may not even realize. If there is one genre where politics are not just present but foundational, it's the modern military shooter. Franchises like Call of Duty, Battlefield, Medal of Honor don't just include political narratives, they are political narratives. They are simulations of imperial violence, often structured through an American or Western-centric lens that echoes the ideologies of real-world occupations, wars, and geopolitical propaganda. And within them lies one of the most enduring and normalized forms of bias, Orientalism. Briefly discussed before, Orientalism refers to the way Western power constructs the East, particularly the Middle East, North Africa, and parts of Asia, as exotic, backwards, violent, and in need of saving or conquering. This concept was never just academic. It formed the ideological backbone of colonialism, and in games, it remains largely intact. Enemies in military shooters are often faceless brown men, screaming Arabic, and wearing a keffiyeh. They are not given names, they're not given motivations, they are simply the enemy. A quick unscripted editor's note that I wanted to add in this section is that the places that these video games often take place in are either based off real places or directly named after real places, just completely removing the people that actually live there, the culture, the languages spoken there, every cultural and social significance that a location can have for people is completely removed, and it's just become a battleground. In Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2019, for example, a mission titled Highway of Death takes directly from a real-world atrocity committed by US forces in Iraq. But in the game, the massacre is blamed on Russia instead. This is not just fictionalization, this is historical revisionism. And then there's Farah Karim, a protagonist in the same Modern Warfare reboot. On paper, she's a step forward, a Middle Eastern woman leading a fictionalized resistance in a fake place against foreign invaders. But scratch the surface, and of course, it's less nuanced than that. Farah's backstory includes her being tortured by the Russians, escaping as a child, and then going on to found a rebellion group aligned with Western interests. Players praised her for being a strong badass, but the critics, especially Middle Eastern players, pointed out how she neatly fit the archetype of the good Middle Easterner, or a perfect victim, one who helps the West fight the bad ones and does not question the West. The problem isn't that Farah exists, it's that she's an exception used to excuse the pattern. She doesn't disrupt the Orientalist narrative, she's used to justify it. Her liberation is defined by her alignment with US military values. She doesn't get a story of national self-determination or any cultural significance related to the land and the people. She gets a gun and a headset and becomes a mascot for acceptable resistance. And when we zoom out, this is the message these games send over and over again. Western violence is necessary and good. Arab, Muslim, brown-skinned resistance is dangerous, chaotic, and must be tamed or destroyed. A growing body of research shows that modern military shooters routinely depict Muslims and Arabs as hostile targets, reinforcing harmful stereotypes. In the 2021 study, The Virtual Killing of Muslims, authors Tanner Merlis and Tariq Radi analyzed 10 popular first-person shooter franchises released between 2001 and 2012. They found that these games consistently portrayed Muslims as the enemy, reducing them to faceless, threatening figures, and embedding Islamophobic narratives into gameplay. The study also argues that these portrayals reinforce a militarized masculinity that positions the Muslim body as a site of justified violence, both symbolically and virtually. Rather than offering complex or humanized characters, these games rely on Orientalist tropes that position Western soldiers as heroic liberators and Muslim-coded characters as violent obstacles to peace. These dynamics continue in contemporary titles, shaping player perceptions and contributing to a cultural climate in which dehumanization is normalized through repetition. This framing isn't harmless. The repetitive portrayal of Arab enemies normalizes viewing them as legitimate targets. A study by Salim and Anderson in 2013 confirmed that players playing a shooter with Arab enemies significantly increased anti-Arab bias in players. You might be thinking, well, I don't believe in that stuff. But here's the thing, it's not what you believe. It's about what you absorb. If you've played these shooters for years and nearly every enemy has been a brown man with a head covering shouting in Arabic, that repetition leaves a mark. It conditions us to see some people as threats by default and others as heroes, even if we never say it out loud or even realize it. These narrative choices aren't neutral. They reinforce real-world ideas of Western military superiority and humanitarian intervention myths. They flatten entire regions into hostile stereotypes and frame resistance as only valid when it doesn't implicate Western power. To be clear, this isn't a critique about demonizing anyone who plays these games. I grew up on COD. I played so much Call of Duty, and to be honest, I was so desensitized. I didn't even think deeper about these topics and who I was shooting in these games until I saw a video called The Gamification of Warfare by Indy Nile, an amazing Palestinian drag creator, and I had to reflect and deconstruct many of the games I loved after I watched that video. I didn't ask why so many enemies looked the same, sounded the same. When the stereotyped enemy ran towards me, I would just shoot. And that's how propaganda and power work. It hides itself in the familiar. It trains us to see violence as normal as long as it's against the right people. Gamer girl culture, fetishization, and ongoing policing of women in gaming. We've talked about how these games can propagandize people to see others as villains, but this is also part of a larger policing of gaming spaces. Just like the enemies in shooters, women in games, especially real women, playing them and making them, are often reduced to stereotypes. Here forms the gamer girl archetype. Oh, that's me. At face value, the game Gamer Girl might just describe someone who plays games and happens to be a woman, but in practice, it has often wielded as both a marketing label and a form of containment. Women are expected to look a certain way, conventionally attractive, flirty, often white, and behave a certain way, friendly but not too opinionated, skilled but not a threat. Deviating from this mold means you'd be labeled a fake gamer, and fitting it too well, you become a sex object with little value. This dynamic plays out constantly for fellow women streamers like myself. The very act of being a woman in gaming spaces is often an invitation for harassment. My own chats and DMs have seen sexual comments, critiques of my appearance, accusations of me selling myself, doxing, harassing, and threats. Meanwhile, men are just allowed to exist as gamers. Not even gamer boys, just gamers. This isn't just trolling. One 2022 report from the ADL found that over 49% of women reported being harassed while playing online games, with higher rates for women of color, queer women, and trans players. This harassment ranged from sexual remarks to doxing and stalking. This culture doesn't just hurt the women playing it. It shapes what kind of stories get made. Developers know that featuring a woman protagonist will often spark some sort of controversy, so they'll soften her or over-sexualize her. Harassment becomes some sort of unspoken push for censorship. Just like everything discussed so far, this is about policing who is comfortable, heard, seen, good, bad, and whose stories are told. This is about the patriarchy and its power. The same dynamics that police women in real life show up here too. And personally, I find it so sad that women can't even feel safe in a virtual escape from the real world scaries that we feel. Corporate inclusion or representation is not what we want. One of the most frustrating patterns in media is how corporations have co-opted the language of inclusion, representation, and diversity, falling for the woke mindset, but just end up masking the deeper issues. The example I want to use for this is Cyberpunk 2077. At first glance, Cyberpunk 2077 seems like a progressive powerhouse. The marketing promised fluid gender customization, queerness, and the critique of mega corporations, surveillance, and capitalism. The setting, a dystopian future ruled by corporate greed, should have been fertile ground for radical critique of capitalism, but instead the game itself often reproduces the systems it claims to challenge. Further complicating Cyberpunk's claim of inclusivity is how the game ties character gender to voice pitch. If you choose a deep voice, you're a male. If you choose a high voice, you're a female, regardless of body or pronouns, which, by the way, does not include they/them pronouns. This reinforces the stereotype that gender is externally defined by appearance or voice, ignoring non-binary identities and trans experiences. LGBTQ players called for both boycotts, citing the fetishization and CDPR's history of trans-insensitive tweets. One of the most controversial images is the Mix It Up poster revealed at E3 2019, featuring a hypersexualized, possibly transgender model with exaggerated genitalia. Though CDPR defended it as satire aimed at critiquing corporate exploitation, many trans critics saw it as fetishization and objectification, shielding Backlash with trans representation. The company's efforts to frame the content as dystopian satire cannot fully mitigate the underlying harm to marginalized communities. Even the game's anti-corporate messages fall apart under scrutiny. CD Projekt Red, or CDPR, the studio behind the game, is a massive corporation itself, notorious for fostering a crunch culture that overworked and exploited its employees, allegedly. In 2020, developers reportedly worked 6-day weeks for months, despite promises not to enforce mandatory overtime. How can a game condemn capitalist exploitation while being built through it? This is emblematic of a larger issue. When companies try to embrace diversity as branding without depth or systematic change, adding a queer character or slapping a pride flag into the background just makes it easier for the reactionaries to mod it out and rage. If your workplace is toxic, your game crunches workers to exhaustion, your representation and pushing of the envelope lacks depth, it's not effective liberation or inclusion. It's marketing. We don't want performative inclusion that feels like a privilege we had to earn and can be stripped away from us. We want depth, real stories, and good games. Sometimes we need to interrogate not just the in-game content, but the corporate intent. Does condemning capitalism ring true when the message is delivered through capitalist loudest tools of destruction? So, in conclusion, gaming isn't under attack. It's evolving. So much of the outrage around wokeness in games is rooted in fear. Fear of change, fear of no longer being centered, fear that the culture is moving beyond a single narrow audience that allows your racism, sexism, and homophobia. But the truth is, gaming isn't under attack. It's evolving. Representation isn't censorship. Diversity is not a threat. Women, trans people, people of color, queer people, Arab people, and Muslim people all exist, live real lives, and have real stories. It is okay to question and analyze the games that bring you comfort and the developers that you may love. We don't need to just accept all representation and pretend it's all perfect. Games have always been political. We do need to ask, though, who benefits when we pretend that only certain kinds of stories are neutral, and who profits when entire identities and regions of places are being called the enemy. This isn't about canceling anyone or any games. It's time to move past outrage and onto something more thoughtful, because the future of gaming doesn't just belong to those reactionaries. It belongs to all of us. So what if it was really that deep, though? Thank you so much for watching. I hope you guys liked it and learned something from it. If you have any topics you want me to talk about next, please let me know. Don't forget to check out my Twitch at BrickyBabe, same with Instagram, everything. Subscribe here, and thank you so much for watching.